In this section, we're going to look at the fundamentals of building applications with Angular. By the end of this section, you will have a basic understanding of Angular building blocks, such as components, templates, directives, and services. So now let's get started. So now that you have some basic familiarity with Angular, let's look at the building blocks of Angular apps. At the heart of every Angular app, we have one or more components. In fact, in a real-world app, we have tens or hundreds of components. But what is a component? A component encapsulates the data, the HTML markup, and the logic for a view, which is the area of the screen that the user sees. Let's look at a real-world example. Imagine we're going to build a website like Udemy. So on this page, we have a navigation bar, a sidebar, and an area to display the list of courses. Now, we can think of all this as one view or one component, or we can break this view into smaller, more maintainable, and potentially reusable components like navbar component, sidebar component, and courses component. Similarly, in courses component, we want to display one or more courses. Potentially, we can break up this component into smaller components. And also, to take this to the next level, each course component can include a rating component. Now we can reuse this rating component in multiple places in the same app or in an entirely different app. As you see, Angular embraces component-based architecture, which allows us to work on smaller and more maintainable pieces that can also be reused in different places. So once again, a component encapsulates the data, the HTML markup, and the logic for a view, which is an area of the screen that the user sees. Every application has at least one component, which we call app component or root component. A real-world Angular app is essentially a tree of components starting from the app component or the root component. Now, in Angular, we also have another concept called modules. A module is a container for a group of related components. Every Angular app has at least one module, which we call app module. As your application grows, you may want to break that module into smaller, more maintainable modules. So in our Udemy example, we can potentially have modules like course module, which includes all the components for displaying courses. We can potentially have another module like messaging module, which includes a bunch of components for the area of the website where you can send private messages to your instructors. We can have an instructor module, which includes the components for instructors' dashboard that you don't see, and potentially admin module, which is the area of the Udemy website managed by the Udemy staff. As an analogy, think of a supermarket. In a supermarket, we have different aisles for different products. We have a section for fruits and vegetables. We have another section for snacks, another for hardware, and so on. The bigger the supermarket, the more aisles we have. In a tiny grocery store, we have probably one or two aisles at the most. The same applies to our Angular apps. So if you're building a simple application, we have only one module, which we call the app module. But as our application grows in functionality, we may need to break that module into smaller modules, with each module responsible for a specific area of our application. In that module, we have a bunch of related components, okay? So this is the big picture. As we go through this course, you will learn about these building blocks in more detail. All right, now let's see these components in action. There are basically 3 steps you need to follow in order to use a component. First, you need to create a component. Second, you need to register that component in a module. And third, you need to add an element in your HTML markup. Let me show you what I mean by this. So, back in our first Angular project, first of all, make sure to run ng-serve to serve this application. So now if you head over to localhost port 4200, this is what you see. Beautiful. Now back in VS Code, I'm going to create a new component. So let's open up the file panel. Here in the source folder, under app, here I'm going to add a new file. Now let's imagine I want to create a component to display the list of courses. So look how I named this file. Courses dot component.ts. This is the convention that we use when building Angular applications. Now, if the name of the component has multiple words, we separate them using a hyphen. For example, if you're building a component called course form, you would call this course-form, and then .component.ts, okay? So courses.component.ts. Now here we start by creating a plain TypeScript class. So class courses component. Once again, look at the naming convention. Here I'm using the Pascal naming convention. So the first letter of every word should be capital. And also by convention, we use the suffix component in the name of the class. So here's our class. In order for Angular to see this class, first we need to export it. Now so far we have only a plain TypeScript class. This is not a component. In order to convert this to a component, we need to add some metadata to it that Angular understands. We use a decorator to achieve this. In Angular, we have a decorator called component that we can attach to a class to make that class a component. So first we need to import this decorator on the top. So import curly braces component from now the name of the library. So at angular/core. This is the core library of Angular that you're going to see a lot in this course. So here we import the component decorator, and then we need to apply it to this TypeScript class. Now look at the syntax. We use @ component, and then call this like a function. So this is what we call a decorator function. Now this function, as you see here, takes an argument. So here we pass an object, and in this object we add one or more properties to tell Angular how this component works. For example, one property that we use quite often is selector. So selector, and we set this to a CSS selector. So in CSS, if I want to reference an element like this, I use a selector like this. If I want to reference an element like a div that has a class called courses, my selector would be .courses, right? And if I want to reference an element with the ID courses, this is my selector. Just basic CSS, okay? So here we want to reference an element called courses. Why? Because with components, we can extend HTML vocabulary. So we can define new elements like courses, and inside that we will have the list of courses. Or in the future, we can define a custom element, a custom HTML element called rating, and wherever we use that, Angular will render a rating component, okay? So let's delete this. My selector for this component is courses. Now the second property we add here is template, and that's the HTML markup we want to be rendered for this component. Now here I want to render something very simple. So let's just add an H2 element and call this courses. In a real world application, our templates can be several lines of code. In that case, we can put them in a separate file, and I'm going to show you how that works later in the course. So this is a basic component in Angular. That was the first step. The second step is to register this component in a module. Now currently our application has only one module, which we call app module. Let me show you where that is. So back here in the app folder, look, we have app.module. Now, once again, here we have 3 import statements on the top, so nothing special here. On the bottom, we have a TypeScript class called app module. And note that this class is decorated with another decorator function called ng module. So with this, we convert a plain TypeScript class to a module from Angular's point of view. Now, don't worry about all these properties here, like declarations, import, providers, and bootstrap. You're going to learn about them later in the course. What I want you to focus on now is this property, declarations. And this is where we add all the components that are part of this module. So by default, when we generate an application, we have one component called app component, and you can see that component is part of this module. Now I'm going to add our new component here. So courses component. So whenever I type the name of a class here and press enter, it automatically imports it on top of my file. So import courses component from, and here's the name of our TypeScript module. So period slash, which refers to the current folder. And here's the name of the file, courses.component. Now note that here we don't have .ts. In fact, if you add that, TypeScript component doesn't like that. So the name of the module is just the name of the file without the extension. So if you want to add this plugin to your VS Code, simply go here and in the extension search box, search for auto import. So currently I'm using auto import 1.2.2. Simply install it and then you'll have to restart VS Code. All right, so here's our second step. Now the third step. Back to our component. So this is the selector for this component, which means anywhere we have an element like courses, Angular is going to render the template for this component inside that element. But where are we going to add that element? Let me show you. So back here in the app folder, we have this app.component.html. This is the external template for our app component. Let's have a look. So all this markup you see here is for rendering the home page. And this is what we get. Now I want to simplify this. I'm going to get rid of all this markup, add a simple h1, call this Angular, and below that I'm going to add our custom element, courses. So when Angular sees this element, it's going to render the template of our courses component. All right, now back in the browser, this is our new homepage. So let's right click this courses element and inspect this. So look what we have here. We have this h1 and below that we have our courses element. And inside this, you can see we have the template for our courses component. So this is how Angular applications work. As another example, look at this app root element inside the body element. Where is this app root? Well, back in the source folder, look at index.html. So this is the basic template for our application, right? Now, inside the body element, we have an element called app-root. This is a custom element because we don't have an element in HTML called app-root. So from Angular's point of view, we should have a component with a selector for this element. And that's our app component. Let's have a look at that. So back in the app folder, let's look at app.component.ts. So here's our root component, our app component. Look at the selector, app-root. So whenever Angular sees an element like that, it's going to render the template for this component inside that element. In this case, our template is external. So we have template URL, and you can see the name of our template file, app.component.html. So that's why inside app-root, here we have the template for app component, which includes an h1 and the courses element. All right, let's quickly review what we have done so far. So we created this courses component here. Then we registered this in app module. So here in app.module, we added our component inside the declarations array, and then finally use this component in the template for app component. So let's quickly review. app.component.html, we added this courses element here. 3 steps, okay? Now, there are 2 problems with this approach. The first problem is that this approach is a little bit tedious. There are so many steps. So first we had to create this TypeScript class. Then we had to import this component decorator on the top. And next we had to apply it on this TypeScript class. There is so much boilerplate code here. Now, the second issue is that if we forget the second step, our application is going to break. Let me show you what happens. So let's go to app.module. I'm going to delete this line here. Now let's see what happens. Back in the browser, we got a blank page. So now we need to look at the console tab of Chrome Developer Tools. So right click anywhere on the page, inspect. So we can see we have two errors here. We can see the details of these errors in the console tab. So here's the error. Courses is not a known element. So if you don't register a component in a module, Angular doesn't know about it. And it doesn't know what to do with this courses element because this is not a native HTML element. So now let me show you a quicker and more reliable way to create an Angular component. We need to go back to the terminal, but look, our terminal is already busy. It's serving the application. So we either have to open a new terminal window, or we can actually open a terminal window inside VS Code. So back here, if you press Control and backtick, which is the character before the number 1 on your keyboard. Look, we have a terminal window here. And this is much easier to access than going back and forth between different windows. So here we can use Angular CLI to generate a component. So just like how we generated an application with ng new, we can also generate a component with this ng. So the syntax is like this: ng space G, which is short for generate, and C, which is short for component. And then the name of the component. Let's say we want to create a component called course. So course. Look at what happened. Angular CLI created a directory called course, and inside this directory added 4 files. A CSS file for storing the style sheets for this component, an HTML file for storing the template, a spec file, which is for writing unit tests for this component, and finally a TypeScript file, which is the actual component itself. Now, what is interesting here is that it also updated app.module and registered this new component. Let's have a look. So we can close this terminal window using the same shortcut, which is Control and backtick. Now we can open the Files panel using Command and B on Mac or Control B on Windows. Okay, look at app.module. So look, inside the declarations array, now we have course component. So this way, we don't have to remember to come back here and register our new components. Now, before we move on, let me just quickly add our courses component that I removed earlier. Okay. Now, back in the Files panel, this is the folder for our new component. So in this folder, we have these 4 files. Now let's take a look at the TypeScript class. It has all the boilerplate code that we wrote earlier, plus a little bit more. So here we're importing the component decorator, and on init, which is an interface, we're going to look at this later in the course. We have this component decorator applied to our TypeScript class. We have a selector. We have the URL of our template file, as well as the URL of our style sheet file. So Angular CLI saves us a lot of time. Now, as we go through this course, I will show you how you can use this tool to generate other building blocks for your applications. So earlier I told you that a component encapsulates the data, the logic, and the HTML markup for a view. So in this example, in our courses component, we have the HTML markup, but we don't have any data or any logic. So let's extend this example and take it to the next level. I want to define a field in this class to hold the title of this page. So title, I'm going to set this to list of courses. Now I want to display this title in our template dynamically. So I'm going to remove this hard-coded label here. In Angular, we have this special syntax, double curly braces, and we use this to render something in our template dynamically. So here I can put this title field. This expression will be evaluated at runtime, and the value of this title field will be placed in our DOM. Now, if the value of this title field changes at some point in the future, Angular will automatically update the DOM. This is one of the beauties of Angular framework. So here we have this concept of data binding. So we are binding our view to a field in this component. Whenever the value of that field changes, the view is automatically notified and updated. All right, now let's save the changes. Back in the browser. All right, here's our new title. Beautiful. Now back here, we don't always have to put the name of a field here. We can write any simple JavaScript expressions. For example, I can put a string here title, colon, and then concatenate this with our title field. Save. Look, this is our new title. Here we can also call a method in this class to get some value. For example, let me define a method, getTitle. And here I'm going to return this, the title. Now, here we can simply call our new method, getTitle, like this, and we'll get the exact same result. There you go, list of courses. So this special syntax here, we call it string interpolation. In the next lecture, I'm going to show you how to render a list of courses here. All right, now let's take this example to the next level. Instead of displaying a simple title field, we want to display the list of courses. So first we need a field to hold the list of courses. So courses, we set this to an array with 3 items, course 1, course 2, and course 3. Now this is a simplified example. In a real-world application, instead of simple strings here, we would have objects. But don't worry, we're going to get there. Now, we want to display these in our template. How should we do that? First, we need to change this single quote to the backtick character. So delete backtick. Backtick is the character before number 1 on your keyboard. Let me change this as well. Now, the benefit of using the backtick is that we can break up this template into multiple lines and make it more readable. So I want to put this h2 here. And below that, I want to add a UL and a bunch of list item elements like this. Now we want to repeat this li for each course. Now for that, we need to use one of the Angular building blocks called directive. We use directives to manipulate the DOM. We can use them to add a DOM element or remove an existing DOM element or change the class of a DOM element or its style and so on. So here, we're going to use a special directive called ng4. We use it like an attribute in HTML. So we set it to a string, and here we're going to write some expression. Now, before going any further, we should prefix this attribute with an asterisk. This is a special syntax in Angular. So whenever you're using a directive that modifies the structure of a DOM, you should prefix that directive with an asterisk. In case you're curious about the reason, I have covered it later in the section about directives. So for now, just remember, whenever you are using a directive that modifies the structure of the DOM by adding or removing an element, you need to prefix that with an asterisk. Now here we want to write an expression similar to what we write in for each blocks. So let course of courses. What does this mean? With the let keyword, we are defining a variable. So the name of our variable is course. This is like a loop variable in JavaScript. Of is a special keyword, and courses is the field in this class that we are iterating over. So when Angular sees this expression, it's going to iterate over the courses field, and in each iteration, this course variable will hold the value of 1 course at a time. Now, inside this list item, you want to display this course. So once again, we use string interpolation, double curly braces, and add this course variable here. Let's look at the result. Save. Back in the browser, and here we have the list of our courses. Beautiful. Now, in most real-world applications, we get these courses from the server. And for that, we need to use another building block of Angular called a service. And that's the topic for the next lecture. All right, now we have the list of courses here. But in a real-world application, most of the time, we get these courses from the server. So instead of hard coding them here, we need to call an HTTP endpoint to get the list of courses. Now here we have 2 options. One is to add the logic for calling an HTTP service here in this component. But there are a couple of problems with this approach. The first problem is that this logic is going to tightly couple this component to that HTTP endpoint. Now in the future, when we want to write unit tests for this class, we don't want to be dependent upon a live HTTP endpoint, because this is going to make it harder to execute those unit tests. So we want to create a fake implementation of an HTTP service. So this is the first issue with writing this logic inside this class, inside this component. It's going to tightly couple this component to that HTTP endpoint. The second issue is that maybe somewhere else in the application, we're going to have another page where we display the list of courses. Maybe it's part of a dashboard. Maybe it's somewhere for an admin. With this implementation, we have to repeat this logic, the logic for consuming that HTTP service in multiple places. And that's not good. And finally, the third issue with this implementation is that a component should not include any logic other than the presentation logic. That is the logic behind this view. What should happen when we click a button, when we select an item from a drop-down list, and so on. Details of how courses are retrieved should be delegated somewhere else in our application. So where should we implement that logic? In Angular, we use services for that. So we're going to define a separate class, which we call a service, and there we'll add this logic for getting the list of courses from an HTTP service. Then we can reuse this class in multiple places. So let me show you how to do that. Here in the app folder, I'm going to add a new file. Now look at the naming convention, courses.service.ts. So the name of our service is courses, and by convention, we have the word service in the file name, and finally .ts. When creating a component, we use courses.component.ts. So note the difference. Now here, once again, we want to export a plain TypeScript class. So export class courses service. So once again, by convention, we add the word service as a suffix in the class name. Now when creating components, we decorate this class with the component decorator. Remember, component. But in Angular, we don't have a decorator for services. So a service is essentially a plain TypeScript class. So delete. Now here we want to add a method for getting the list of courses. Get courses. For now, we don't want to get distracted with the complexity of consuming an HTTP service. So let's just return the same array that we had in our component, and later I will show you how to consume an HTTP service. So back in our component, I'm going to select this array here, cut, back in the service, and simply return it from this method. Now imagine here in this method, we have that logic for consuming an HTTP service. With this implementation, we can reuse this class, we can reuse this logic in multiple places in our application. And also, this will separate or decouple our component from this logic. So back in our component, here we're not going to have any logic for consuming an HTTP service. And this allows us to unit test this class without dependency upon that HTTP endpoint. So while unit testing this class, we can provide a fake implementation of that service. Now, if that's too complicated, don't worry about it. Unit testing is something for the future. Okay, now we have a service. We need to use this service in our component. How? That's the topic for the next lecture. Okay, now we have a service to get the list of courses from the server. We need to use this service in this courses component. So first we need to add a constructor here, constructor, because a constructor is where we initialize an object. So here we need to create an instance of our courses service, something like this. Let service be new courses service. Once again, I'm using the auto import plugin. So when I press enter, it automatically adds the import statement here on the top. So import courses service from current folder courses.service. All right, now back in the constructor. So we have a service, and then we can initialize this courses field like this. This.courses, we set this to service.get courses. Let's test the application and make sure everything works up to this point. Save. Okay, we get the same list. Beautiful. However, there is a problem with this implementation. The first problem is that by using this new operator here, we have tightly coupled this courses component to the courses service. So this is exactly like the problem we had earlier. If we implemented the logic for consuming an HTTP service inside this component, we wouldn't be able to unit test this class. Now we put this logic in a different class, courses service, but because we're directly creating an instance of this class here, we're still tightly coupled to that implementation. The other issue here is that if in the future we decide to add a parameter to the constructor of courses service, we have to come back here and anywhere else in our application where we have used this courses service and add a new argument, like 1. So anytime we change the constructor of this service, we end up with multiple changes in our application code. So this is very fragile. So what should we do? Well, instead of recreating an instance of the courses service, we can ask Angular to do that for us. So we can delete this line here and add a parameter in this constructor, call it service, of type courses service. With this, when Angular is going to create an instance of our component, it looks at this constructor, it sees that this constructor has a dependency. This dependency is of type courses service. So first it creates an instance of the courses service and then passes that to this constructor. Now with this implementation, if we change the constructor of courses service and add a new parameter, we don't have to modify 100 places in our code to reflect the change. Angular would automatically instantiate a new courses service object. The second benefit of this implementation is that when we're going to unit test this courses component, instead of supplying an actual courses service to this constructor, we can create a fake implementation of this service that doesn't use that HTTP service on the backend. In other words, we have decoupled our courses component from courses service. So here's the lesson. When you use the new operator like this inside a class, you have tightly coupled your class to that implementation. You cannot change this at runtime. But when you add that dependency as a parameter of a constructor, you have decoupled that class from that dependency. Now, we're not done yet. We need to instruct Angular to create an instance of courses service and pass it to our courses component. This concept is called dependency injection. So we should instruct Angular to inject the dependencies of this component into its constructor. As simple as that. That's dependency injection. A lot of people think dependency injection is so complicated, but it's really a $25 term for a 5-cent concept. So dependency injection means injecting or providing the dependencies of a class into its constructor. Now, Angular has a dependency injection framework built into it. So when it's going to create an instance of a component, it can inject the dependencies. But in order for that to work, we need to register these dependencies somewhere in our module. So let's save the changes. Now we need to go to our app.module. So here's app.module. Okay, look at this ng module decorator. Here we have a property called providers, which is set to an empty array. In this array, we need to register all the dependencies that components in this module are dependent upon. For example, our courses component is dependent upon courses service. So we need to register courses service as a provider in this module. So here I'm going to add courses service. Now, if you forget this step, dependency injection is not going to work. Let me show you what happens. So I'm going to comment out this line, save, back to the browser. We get a blank page, so that means something is wrong. Let's open up Chrome Developer Tools with Shift, Command, and I on Mac or Shift, Control, I on Windows. Look at this error, no provider for courses service. This is an error that you might see quite often when building Angular apps. So the error is telling us that we have not registered courses service as a provider in our module. So back in app module, I'm going to add this courses service here, save, back in the browser, and we have the list of courses. Now, one more thing before we finish this lecture. When you register a dependency as a provider in a module, Angular will create a single instance of that class for that entire module. So imagine in this module, we have 100 components, and 50 of these components need the courses service. In the memory, we're going to have only a single instance of courses service, and Angular will pass the same instance to all these components. This is what we call the singleton pattern. So a single instance of a given object exists in the memory. So a quick roundup. Back in our component, we added courses service as a parameter in the constructor, or in other words, as a dependency of this class, and then registered this as a provider in our app module. With this implementation, when Angular is going to create an instance of this component, first it will instantiate its dependencies, and then it will inject those dependencies into the constructor of this class. And this is what we call dependency injection. All right, now let me show you a quick way to create a service in Angular. So we go to the terminal. Once again, you can switch to the terminal window, or you can press Control and backtick in VS Code. So here we have a small terminal window. We're going to use Angular CLI to generate a service. So ng G for generate. Previously we used C for components. Now we're going to use S for services. Imagine we're going to create a service for sending emails. This service is going to call an HTTP endpoint somewhere for sending these emails. So let's call this email. And note that here I just add the service name. I don't need to add .service. Okay? So this generates two files for us. One is the actual service file, and the other is a spec file, which includes some boilerplate code for writing unit tests for that service. So in the app folder, look, here's our new service, email.service.ts. So we have a plain TypeScript class called email service, but there is something extra here that you didn't see before. We have this injectable, which is another decorator function, similar to the component decorator function. Why do we need this here? We would need this decorator only if this service had dependencies in its constructor. For example, imagine here we had a dependency like log service of type log service. In this case, we need to apply this injectable decorator function on this class, and this tells Angular that this class is an injectable class, which means Angular should be able to inject dependencies of this class into its constructor. Now, we didn't use this decorator when defining components, because when we use the component decorator, that decorator internally includes this injectable decorator. So that's all about injectable. And by the way, note that this decorator function is defined in Angular/core library.